All right, so James Baldwin is our focal author for the week, and he had a fantastically interesting life, to say the least. He was born in 1924 in the New York neighborhood of Harlem, and he was raised by his mother and his stepfather, a Baptist minister. He never knew his biological father, but he was the eldest of nine children, and he discovered his passion for reading and writing at a young age, and he often found himself at the library. As a teenager, he emulated his stepfather, a strict preacher, by preaching to a small congregation in this kind of Pentecostal. I can't remember the name of it, but I know it was Pentecostal kind of group. But he became increasingly involved in religion in his early life, and because of that, you can see religious allusions and themes in a lot of his writings. In 1944, he moved to Greenwich Village, where he developed a friendship with Richard Wright, an African American writer. And with his help, Wright's help, Baldwin won a literary grant in 1948, which he used to move to Paris and support his writing. He revisited Europe throughout his life, citing its importance in giving him perspective on his experiences in America and liberating him to write about controversial American themes. It was in Europe that Baldwin wrote and published his first and perhaps most critically acclaimed piece of fiction, Go Tell It on the Mountain, a novel about religion and the African American experience. And later, during the this kind of period, his first time in Europe in 1956, he wrote Giovanni's Room, in which he turned to his own struggles with homosexuality for inspiration. The time he spent in France and other European countries enabled Baldwin to escape the racial and personal pressures that constrained him in the United States. His years in Europe, he says, were crucial in giving him perspective. In the early 1960s, however, Baldwin returned to the U.S. Because he felt this kind of deep responsibility as an American and as a black man to aid in the civil rights movement. He was a grandson of As the grandson of a slave, he felt that his voice was prolific to the movement, and due to that, he felt an obligation to come back to the States. He left right after the assassination of he left America and went back to Europe after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. He spent the rest of his life in Europe, and he died on December 1st in 1987 of stomach cancer at the age of 63. He died as one of the most important and vocal advocates for equality and one of the most important authors in the modern American canon. And despite being one of the most powerful African American voices of the 20th century, Baldwin preferred not to think of himself as an American author and not as an African American author. As an artist, he wished to speak for the entire human race, and ultimately, his stories are universal tales of suffering, struggle, redemption, and love, which all of those can be found in our work for the week. It's really a beautiful, beautiful story. Some of his, he's not like the other authors that we have read this unit, in that he creates these like complex, convoluted, twisty turn narratives that take forever to understand. But he did have a kind of certain writing style, in that he wrote a lot about taboo topics of the day. As an openly gay man, Baldwin was also known for his frank treatment of taboo topics like homosexuality and interracial relationships. And also because of his religious upbringing and his background, you can see a lot of religious and biblical allusions and symbolism in his work as well, and a lot of those transcend into the themes of his work. And although he is best known as a novelist and essayist, he was also a playwright, a poet, a critic, and a writer of short stories. So he is a he has a fascinating life, or had a fascinating life, and his work is really quite something to behold, as you will see when we read Sonny's Blues. And Sonny's Blues is such a great story. I love this story. I hope you guys too. But it definitely ties back into the Harlem Renaissance, and that it most obviously takes place in Harlem during the 1950s. But we can also see kind of, I mean, you really get a feel in this setting of the feel of Harlem and what that whole movement was all about. So, um, however, it's not all, this idea of Harlem being, this setting. It also helps create this environment of not only kind of the African American experience and this kind of new movement and finding a voice, but we also see the city playing an important role in this story, because Harlem was also a kind of a place of vice and poverty and violence, and our one of our characters turns to drugs and is an escape of feeling trapped by his surroundings. And we really have these people suffering from poverty, and what's going on in the inner city. So anyways, Sonny's Blues, it was published originally in 1957. But it also found its way in Baldwin's 1965 book, Going to Meet the Man, which was a collection of short stories for him. Our narrative, it's pretty straightforward, and some critics have said, and because we spent so much time talking about the origins of the short story, I felt it only right to kind of mention and emphasize that some critics have said that this is a retelling of the parable of the prodigal son. And if you're not familiar with that, Google it. It's great. But this is a story. The main plot is about two brothers who really lack the ability to understand one another. We see in them these tensions between past and present, of assimilation and striking out on one's own, and really this kind of failure to communicate, and how that kind of and not only between the two brothers, but between the family as a whole, and this inability to communicate, and this keeping secrets and things of that nature. We see these tensions between past and present, modern, future, that kind of thing. All of the things that we really talked about in all of our stories during this unit. So keep an eye out for that. Our point of view is a first person. It is told from the perspective of Sonny's brother, who's the unnamed narrator. And the question that I want you guys to think about as we read this story, who's this story really about? Is it about Sonny, the brother, or both? Because the story title suggests that it's about Sonny and Sonny's Blues, but our story is told by Sonny's older brother. Some themes in the story, like I said earlier, about addiction, this kind of idea of life imitating art, the expression of pain and suffering, family conflicts, the tensions between past and present, imprisonment, whether that is physically or kind of emotionally, because this really is about the psychological experience that Sonny has, and how he and his brother too, because the brother, as you'll see, is has his own struggles that he's dealing with. This concept of the blues, which we'll talk about when we come together, this idea of redemption, which all of James Baldwin's stories have this idea of this kind of hopeful view of things, anger and racism that are so beautifully woven together into this story. The one thing that I do want you to pay attention to is this idea of music and jazz and suffering, and how the expression of that pain and suffering, or the inability to do so. So take that for what you will. I'm so excited to talk to you guys about Sonny's Blues. It is a little bit on the longer side, so I would get started reading sooner rather than later, and I look forward to talking with you guys about it later on this week.